Good evening, everybody. Again, I want to welcome everyone here tonight. My name is Paul O'Neill on behalf of Kingston's Buried Treasures. We're glad to have you tonight for our fourth installment, and the subject tonight is Sojourner Truth. The caption is Sojourner Truth, Ulster County's Voice of Freedom, but Sojourner Truth is really America's voice for freedom. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone else who is as noted for their fight for equality and for both racial and she fought for gender equality. And it's an honor for all of us as residents of Ulster County. She began here. This is the place that started her on a lifetime journey that affected not only New York State, not only the United States, but the international community. So she's a very, very important person, and we're glad to be able to honor her tonight. And we're especially glad that we have Ann Gordon as a presenter tonight. Ann Gordon, I'm sure most people probably know her. She is the Ulster County historian, and on top of that, I think she's probably one of the preeminent experts on Sojourner Truth. And I know she's dedicated at least the last 4 years to Sojourner Truth. So she is here on behalf of Kingston's Buried Treasures. She's also a member of Kingston's Buried Treasures. So again, without further ado, Ann, we turn over the ship to you.
Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to start off with the words of a song that Sojourner Truth wrote. She was a famous singer and often sang to introduce her lectures on anti-slavery. I am pleading for my people, a poor downtrodden race, who dwell in freedom's boasted land with no abiding place. I'm pleading for my people, may they have their rights restored, for they have long been toiling and yet had no reward. While I bear upon my body the scar of many a gash, I'm pleading for my people who groan beneath the lash. And the final verse, I plead with you to sympathize with sighs and groans and scars, and note how base the tyranny beneath the stripes and stars. How do we know so much about Isabella as she was known? That was her name she was born with as a slave. We know because she left her story with us. Although she was unable to read or write, she dictated the story of her life to a friend who took it all down and in typical Victorian fashion cleaned up the naughty bits and presented us with a picture of the life of a slave here in Ulster County. Here are some early photographs of Sojourner Truth. As you see there, she sold copies of them to support herself, and she also sold copies of her book. As she traveled around the country speaking, she wanted to be self-supporting. Very independent lady. This is the home of Colonel James Hardenberg in Riften, New York. Isabella's parents were slaves there. He owned between 7 and 9 slaves at one point, which was quite a large amount for Ulster County. She was born, we think, about 1797. Being a slave, there was no birth certificate or official notification of her birth, so we're just guessing. Her parents lived in a little wooden shack next to the Hardenberg house. Those were very traditionally known as slave kitchens, and they were where the slaves slept during the time when they weren't working, just rude wooden shacks, sometimes with a fireplace. Colonel Hardenberg died when Sojourner was 2, and her parents and she and her remaining brother were inherited by his son Peter, who owned a tavern called the Black Swan. I say her remaining brother because her parents had more than 13 children, but she only knew her younger brother Peter. All the rest had been sold or given away before she was born. Her mother and father worked for Peter Hardenberg at the Black Swan. doing all the things that needed to be done and living at this time in the basement, in which she describes very dramatically as being damp, cold year-round. They slept on floorboards. They had no bedding. There was no fireplace. It was really a hard place to live. While above them was this huge structure with roaring fireplaces, beds for guests, ballrooms, and whatnot. Well, Peter Hardenberg died when she was about 8 or 9. And by the time they settled his estate, they had done an inventory. And that's our first introduction of official record of Sojourner's life, when she appears on the inventory as Negro Wench Isabella, value $100. She's listed down among the agricultural implements and pots and pans. Her brother Peter was also worth $100, and her mother Bet had no value. So to settle the estate, she was auctioned off, she and her brother. We don't know anything of what happened to him, but we do know that she was bought by a man named John Neely, who had a store over in Wilbur. It was called Swartikill in those days. She refers to John Neely as an Englishman, but in fact he was what we would call a Yankee. He was from Connecticut and an entrepreneur, and came to the Hudson Valley to set up this little store. Of course, having grown up in the countryside in Riften, Isabella didn't speak English. She spoke what everyone in the country spoke then, which was Low Dutch. And it was a source of tremendous problems, because Neely and his wife were from New England. They didn't speak Low Dutch. And so when Mrs. Neely asked for a pot and Isabella brought back an apron, things got very unpleasant. And the way they decided to teach her English was to beat her every time she made a mistake. And she got such a severe beating from Mr. Neely in the end that she bore the scars of it for her entire life. And later on, when as an abolitionist she was speaking and someone said to her, "You were never a slave," she was able to pull down the back of her dress and show the scars on her back. She had them her whole life. Well, her father helped her find a new master. That was a typical tactic during those days. If a slave was really unhappy, he looked around for a new master. And her father found her a place with another Revolutionary War veteran named Martinus Shriver, who had a little tavern. It's still standing today on Broadway in Port Ewan at the corner of River Road. And it doesn't look much like this anymore. It's been modified quite a few times, but the building itself is still there. This was called a jug tavern, which meant that people came in and got a drink from a jug. It was not like the Black Swan, where they had dining rooms and bedrooms and ballrooms. It was simply a place to drop in and have a quick drink. The Shrivers had bought a lot of acreage around, including that tavern, and they were a very kindly people. They actually spoke Low Dutch, but they helped her to learn English. She also said she learned to curse and to smoke and to drink while she was working for them. She gave up the cursing and the drinking, but never gave up smoking, even as an old lady. She really enjoyed it. So her work with the Dumonds was not the kind of work she had done at the Black Swan, cooking, cleaning, carrying things. She was sent down to the Rondout to take the little ferry across and buy jugs of liquor and molasses. She was sent to bring back baskets of fish. She helped to grow corn and herbs and things to make beer on their little farm. Well, in 1910, Mr. Shriver was in financial distress, and he also had 2 teenage sons growing up, and decided the best thing to do would be to sell Isabella, to take her. She was growing up too, and he thought it would be the best thing to get her away from his sons and to take advantage of her market value, which had gone up from $100 to $175, because now she was trained. She could do housework. She could do cooking and cleaning around the tavern. She could do farming. She had a number of marketable skills. And so she left the Shrivers, and went to live with John Dumond down in what is now West Park. In those days it was New Paltz. He had a very large farm. He had a very large number of slaves working for him, and there she worked in a proper household where she learned things like weaving and spinning and laundry and sick room care and child care. Those are some of the things that she did, but she also worked in his fields, plowing and reaping, spinning, all these skills. She was a very hard worker and prided herself on it. Dumond said as she grew older, she was worth 2 men because that's how hard she worked. He married her off to one of his slaves. The poor man's first 2 wives had been sold away, and so he was given Isabella, and they had 4 children together. Well, time was moving on. New York State, the last of the New England states to pass laws about emancipation of slaves after the Revolutionary War, had declared that anybody born before 1828 would be free. They had to be 28 years of age, however. Well, Isabella had been born in 1797, so she was old enough to fit in the guidelines of people who were deserving of freedom. And somehow she knew that she was deserving of freedom. And I'll talk more about that part of her character later. And Dumond made a deal with her. If she was to be freed in 1827, he said to her in 1825, if you work extra hard for the next year, I'll free you in 1826. And she agreed that she would do that. Well, of course, during that year, she had a baby, and she also lost a finger from her hand doing agricultural work. So she had 2 things to hold her back, but she felt she fulfilled the bargain, and she deserved to be freed. Well, Dumond disagreed and said, no, you'll have to wait until 1827 for your freedom. She knew she deserved it, and she remembered what her mother had said, that it's a sin to run away from your master. And so she said, I won't run away, I'll walk away. And her mother said, you should never, especially run away in the night. So she decided she would run away between the night and the daytime, just at dawn. And so she took her 3-month-old baby on her hip and a little handkerchief with her belongings in it, and she walked away to freedom. Whoops. She walked away to the home of Isaac and Maria Van Wagenen in St. Remy. They were well known for being anti-slavery. Sometimes they're described as Quakers, but they were not. They were good members of the Reformed Church. But they agreed that she could come and live with them and work while she got herself together. Well, of course, it's hard for us to imagine what a small community this all was. Everybody knew everything about everybody else, and it didn't take any time at all for word to reach Dumond that Isabella was living with the Van Wagenens. And so he got in his cart and he drove over and he said to her, you're not free, get in, I'm taking you back. And she refused. And the Van Wagenens made a deal with her that they would give him $20 for her unfulfilled year of labor and that she would be free. And she agreed to that, and she went to work for the Van Wagenens to work off that $20. You want to ask, why did she leave behind her other children? Well, she had no choice. They were not her property. They belonged to Mr. Dumond and would until they reached the age of 28. And this is a map that shows Isabella's walk. Right across the whole town of Esopus, from Dumond down in West Park all the way up to St. Remy, where the Van Wagenens lived. The next part of her story takes place right here in Kingston. This is the Ulster County Courthouse, and it was built in 1818. The front looked just the way the front looks today. Isn't it amazing? Except there's no whipping post in the front or stocks for punishment of people. We took those away. What happened was, while she was working for the Van Wagenens, Mr. Dumont gave away her son Peter to his neighbors. The neighbors then gave Peter to their daughter, who married a man in Alabama and took him to live in Alabama. Well, according to the manumission laws, it was illegal to take a child slave out of New York State. And Isabella was so upset, she went to the Dumonts and pleaded that they return her son. And they said, "What do you care? You'll have other sons. Don't make a fuss about it." So she came back and met with some Quakers who told her that she needed to go to court and sue for the return of her son. So she walked from St. Remy into Kingston. Someone had said, "You have to go to the grand jury." She didn't know what a grand jury was, and so she looked at a man who was the best dressed man she saw, so grand, she said, "He must be the grand jury." And she went up to him and told him the story. Well, it so happened he was a lawyer, and he took her right to court, where they swore out a writ against Mr. Gedney, the man who had taken her son to Alabama, whose daughter had taken the son. Mr. Gedney was still living in West Park, and told him that if he did not return the child, he would have to pay the court $600. Now, that's an enormous amount of money. And so Mr. Gedney set out to travel to Alabama and bring back the son, Peter. It took him a year. And during that time, Isabella lived here in Kingston, working as a domestic, supporting herself and paying the money that she owed back to the Van Wagenens. She worked for a lawyer named Peter Romaine, but the main person that she worked for, and I'm convinced he was the man giving her legal advice, was Abraham Brune Hosbrook. He had just come back from serving in Congress. In those days, you served 2 years and then you came home. And he was a brilliant up-and-coming young lawyer living over at 35 Green Street in his family's house. And she lived in the basement. I would love to see that basement. And in any case, after the year was up, Gedney showed up with Peter and took him to court, where he was returned to his mother. And the judge said at that time that Peter is no longer the property of Mr. Dumont, that he is the property of his mother. During the time that she was here in Kingston, she walked past a very small white frame building on the corner of Fair Street and, I can't remember the other one, but it was the Methodist Church. You know where that is. It wasn't the big building we see today. And she heard them singing inside, "There is a holy city, the home of God above." And she was just entranced. This is a person who had never been to church, had never heard hymns, had never had anything to do with religion except what her mother taught her, which was a more naturalistic religion. But her mother did tell her that God was in the sky watching her. She heard this hymn, and she went inside, and they welcomed her with open arms and told her to come and sit with the congregation and learn about Jesus. Well, this was just a revelation to her. And she became what one of the Van Wagenens referred to as a ranting Methodist. She wanted to convert everybody. So while she was here in Kingston, she became a member of the Methodist Church. She was given a membership paper that showed that she was a member in good standing. And she learned a tremendous amount, not only about religion, but also the hymns that they sang, which she could sing until her dying day, every single word, every single verse. When she got the return of her son, the Methodists asked her if she would like to join them. They were sending a delegation down to live in New York City and work as missionaries on the streets of New York. And she felt that this indeed was her calling, and so she went. And she worked for 4 or 5 years in New York City, working with people on the street, prostitutes. She went into the prisons of women and worked to convert them and to make their lives easier, whatever she could do. She got involved with a rather weird sect, but she seemed to be attracted to sort of outside groups. In the end, she decided to set out on her own. Her son Peter had gone to, after numbers of jobs, he'd gone to work on a whaling ship out of New Bedford. And so she was on her own and decided she was going to take to the road and preach to people wherever she found them. And in order to do that, she felt she needed a new name. She had been calling herself Isabella van Wagenen in honor of the people who helped her get her freedom. But she decided to name herself Sojourner because that would be her new life. She would be moving from place to place. And someone said to her, "But everyone has 2 names. What's your second name?" And she decided to pray for it, and in a prayer received a message that her new name was to be Truth, because she would be spreading the truth. And so she set off, going on east on Long Island, going to meetings in fields, revival meetings, that sort of thing was going on a lot in those days, and preaching her message. Now you have to picture her. She was already in her 40s, dressed very plainly, speaking a heavily accented English because her first language was Dutch. But she was a great success, and because of her singing, she was able to draw people to her, to listen to her message. And she was there to preach redemption, and she was part of the religious movement at that time. Somehow or another, she found her way to Northampton, Massachusetts, where she joined a society of people who were living communally and in the silk business, raising silkworms and weaving silk. And this interesting commune was also a real nest of abolitionists. They came from all over to live there and be taken care of while they were recovering from the hardships of life on the road. I don't know if you know, but abolitionists traveling around the Northeast were stoned and pelted with garbage and chased out of places. They were treated very badly. So they would come to Northampton, to this refuge. And while she was there, she studied what they said, what their message was, how it applied to her, how she could be an abolitionist speaker, a speaker of rights of the people she talked about in her song. And she was there for about 4 years, did well enough to buy a house for her daughters, who finally left Dumont and came to live with her. And from there, she ranged out all over the New England states, all over New York State. She went up to Auburn and Seneca Falls a lot because there were a lot of abolitionists up there, very well-known, prosperous ones. She went out to Ohio. There were a lot of abolitionists there, and they took her from town to town as she talked against the war. When the war came, and she was totally opposed to it, she felt that slavery could be stopped by people if they understood in their heart that it was a terrible thing to treat other human beings this way. And that was her message. We are your brothers and sisters. How can you treat us like this? And Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist speaker, said, "Blood must be shed." And Sojourner, who was in the audience when he said that, responded, "Frederick, is there no God?" Meaning, is there no God to change people's hearts, to help them see what a sin slavery is? Well, Frederick was right. Blood would be shed. So during the war, Sojourner went down to Washington, D.C. Ex-slaves were pouring into Washington from the South because it was the home of Father Abraham, who was bringing freedom to the slaves. So here were these people just pouring in with no place to live, no way to look after themselves. So freemen villages were established, and the biggest one was on the grounds of the home of Robert E. Lee in Arlington, Virginia, which is now, of course, the Arlington Cemetery. And so they built housing for the slaves, and Sojourner's role there was to teach them how to keep house, how to look after their children, and also to urge them to lead lives of virtue and honor. And she found it very hard work because she was dealing with people who had never had any responsibility for themselves for their whole lives. She also helped to organize transports. By then, of course, there was the railroad system, to take freed slaves out to the West, where they were in great need of trained agricultural laborers in states like Michigan and Kansas. So they would move out whole trainloads of freed slaves out to the West. She went out to Battle Creek to help set up reception committees and aid committees to when the slaves came in, that they would be looked after and fed and housed and new lives made for them. After the end of the Civil War, she decided to move to Battle Creek herself. Her two daughters had already moved out there, and so she moved to Battle Creek and bought a little home. Whoops. And she lived there until she died in 1883. And I don't know if you can see it on the tombstone, but it says she was 105 years old. Well, of course she wasn't. I don't know who put that on there. But she also said, "Is God dead?" Her remark to Frederick Douglass. And this is in the Oak Lawn Cemetery in Battle Creek. She's buried right next to one of the great cereal makers, Wilbur Post. And while she was there, she had a lot of trouble with her feet and legs, and you wouldn't be surprised with all that walking. And she had a wonderful young doctor named Thomas Kellogg who looked after her. In 1995 was established the Sojourner Truth Institute, which has extensive archives of Sojourner Truth's records of her life and artifacts. Every article that was ever printed in a newspaper during her life and after is on file there. It's an amazing, amazing collection. I was out there last year, and I was just blown away by the amount of work they've done putting that together. Excuse me. Well, as of course, we began to realize the role that Sojourner Truth played in the life of our country, more and more statues began to be erected to her. And this one was erected in Florence, Massachusetts, where she was part of that silk weaving community. And it's about 7 feet tall. Oh, I say that, 7 feet tall. It's a beautiful work of art. And every year they have a Sojourner Truth event with songs and speaking and so forth. It's very nice. And this statue was paid for by the people of Florence, Massachusetts themselves. No funds or grants or anything, just the people who felt that she needed to be honored by their town. This is this statue that was erected to her in Battle Creek on the 200th anniversary of her birth. And it says there, you can see the man on her left, Tom McLeachy, is a fifth great grandson. And those two people, the Martages, were the ones who founded the archives. It's right in the middle of Battle Creek, right next to the City Hall, and facing it is a huge amphitheater with stone seats so that all kinds of events can take place there. And there's a list of every single business and person who gave money for the statue in bronze plaques around it. It's the most impressive thing you've ever seen. And also funds from the National Association of Negro Business and Professional Women and community donations. The name of the sculptress for that was Tina Allen. but Tina gave her a finger where she didn't have one. She wasn't aware of the story that she had lost her finger, and so she's got them all, right? And here's the unveiling of the statue in, this is 2008, Corinne? Yes? It's in the Hall of Visitors in the Capitol building. And I don't remember the name of that sculptress, but it's as you can see, again, larger than life, very handsome, and made larger than life to reflect the impact that she's had on our country. And here, closer to home, on the lawn of the courthouse, is a plaque honoring Sojourner and telling about her court case here and its importance. And I believe, Paul, am I right, they're naming the courthouse for her?
It is named the Sojourner.
It is named the Sojourner Truth Courthouse, which is something I didn't know until I heard Paul say it. Right. Tremendous amount of books have been written about her. I just have a few of the covers here, but I did prepare a short bibliography if anybody's interested in having a list of the books about her, and they're readily available, and make fascinating reading. Of course, there's our own Carlton Mabie. His book is very interesting. And she has her own paper doll. It's very interesting. This doll was designed by Tom Tierney, who's a very well-known paper doll artist. And the costumes that she's shown wearing, of course, they all show her as an old lady, are actual clothing that she wore. At the Sojourner Truth Institute, they have some of the garments there. And others we can tell by what she's wearing in all the photographs that she took. And this one here closest to me is a dress that everyone said was sent to her by Queen Victoria. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a very handsome dress. Okay. And I just thought you'd like to see some of her descendants. She has more than 400. They're divided between Michigan and California. And in a minute I'll tell you why we have pictures of children here. In Port Ewan, we have decided to honor her by erecting a statue on the site of a new pocket park created by the Department of Transportation when they tore down Town Hall. And we started that program was started in 2004. And a committee was appointed of 4 ministers. Well, you think ministers don't have enough to do without having to plan the erection of a memorial? And so they decided to pick a working committee to handle the actual nuts and bolts of the memorial. And so I'm on the working committee, and Reverend Evelyn Clark, there's our town supervisor, John Coutant, and Cynthia Lowe from the Community Foundation, which is our 501c3 fundraising arm. They've been very, very helpful. So we started to work trying to decide what form we wanted the statue to take. We knew we didn't want to show her as an old lady in a frilly hat. We wanted to show her at the age she was when she lived in Port Ewan, when she was working at Shriver's Jug Tavern, walking up and down the highway, right past the site where the statue will stand. And so we came to an agreement that we would show her as an 11-year-old girl and at work. So we interviewed a number of artists and then chose Trina Green from New Paltz to be our artist. And she used as a model her 11-year-old granddaughter, who was all arms and legs, and to show how the loads that she was carrying would affect her bone structure and musculature and whatnot. This statue is right now at Sculpture House in New York City being turned into bronze, and I thought we'd never get it done. try to raise $91,000. It's a lot of money. We started off with concerts of Sojourner's music. We sold the paper dolls, we sold books, and just tried to think of everything we could do. We wrote letters, of course, to all kinds of funding sources with some success. And then our Assemblyman, Kevin Cahill, came into the picture and said, "How much do you need?" So we told him, and he said, "Good, we'll do it. We'll get a capital grant, New York State Assembly capital grant for this work." And he did. And that really is paying for the majority of this. And I just couldn't be more grateful to Kevin. First of all, I think I'll live a little longer if I don't have to do fundraising all the time. And second of all, it was his just unquestioning acceptance of the importance of honoring Sojourner Truth in the town of her birth that just made my heart beat very happily. So we hope by the late spring we will have paved the park and put in something for the statue to stand on. And we're planning an enormous dedication. And there are two ladies whose name begin with O that we would like very much to attend, Mrs. Obama and Oprah, both of whom have said publicly, when asked who their civil rights heroines or heroes are, the first name they say is Sojourner Truth. So we hope they'll come. Who knows? In examining the life and the words of Sojourner Truth, oh wait, I forgot one thing. She's not only in the Women's Hall of Fame at Seneca Falls, but she's also in the Robot Hall of Fame in Cleveland, because the first Mars rover, the name was chosen by school children, and the name they chose was Sojourner. And so you can see a little picture of her rover, the Sojourner, that was the first one sent to Mars. And I think that was terrific. Not only is she known internationally, but intergalactically. I love it. In examining the life and words of Sojourner Truth, I wondered, how did an enslaved, uneducated farm worker develop such a sense of her own worth and purpose? And I came to the conclusion that she had a number of unique inborn qualities. She was not concerned with the judgment of others concerning her own actions. She was empowered from within to find her own path. She understood that she had a purpose to fulfill, and she used her creative forces to do so. By doing so, she was freed from the need to dominate or submit, and her life became a creative, self-motivated instrument to fulfill her inborn pattern. And here's a quote from Carlton Mabie. She became in her own time and hours an inspiration to blacks and to women, to the poor and to the religious. She was a remarkably honorable figure for us to focus on when we look at the past and seek heroes or heroines. She was a woman who struggled against terrible odds and poverty all her life. So that's it. That's my talk about Sojourner, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Okay. Yes, I saw a hand. Yes.
Is the birth house in Riften still standing?
Yes, it is. It's owned by a very wealthy man who works for some international corporation who's not happy about the association. And so he's planted at the roadside an enormous hedge so you can't even see the house, much less come up and knock on his door.
Is it on 213?
No, it's on Kearney Road. Right. You can see it from 213. If you stand where Swartikill Creek flows into the pond there and look back, you'll see it up on the hillside there, a charming little stone house. The slave kitchen that she was actually born in was torn down long, long ago. But it's amazing to me how many places that she lived in are still standing here in Ulster County, as you just saw. 4 or 5 of the stone houses, and of course the house on Green Street is still standing, and the courthouse. So we have a tremendous heritage of Sojourner Truth's life to celebrate.
Any other questions?
Yes.
And the plaque in front of the courthouse actually says she was born in Hurley.
Well, technically, she was born in Hurley because town lines changed. When Esopus was founded, the part that was the old Hardenberg patent, which came across the Wallkill right into Esopus like that, that was where Josiah Hardenberg's house was. It was on the Wallkill. He had a big grist mill. But in, I think it was 1843, the town lines of Esopus were changed, and so the town line was pushed back to the Wallkill, and down in West Park it was pushed further south to bring in that part of New Paltz. So technically, yes, she was born in Hurley. But there were 2 Colonel Josiah Hardenbergs. One lived in Hurley in a huge mansion, which is also still standing, and his cousin, the other Josiah Hardenberg, lived in what is now Riften. But we know she was the property of the one in Riften. Yes? Yes?
Did she meet Lincoln?
Yes, she did. She went to the White House, and I'm sorry they didn't put that part in this new movie about him, because it was right at that time that she met him. But she did meet him, and she carried around, it was sort of an autograph book, and she actually had him sign her book, and she said, "You know, I never heard of you before you ran for president." And he said, "Well, I've heard of you." So I don't know if that's apocryphal or not, but it's a cute story. Yes. Any other? Yes.
You know, having studied her life so deeply, if you were to walk around with her through the local town, let's say you would drive her around and get out of the car and walk around the kids and the businesses and everything happening, can you guess at what some of her reflections might be, or what she'd notice, what she'd appreciate, what she'd be critical of? Anything come to your mind in terms of how far we've come from the great chances she took to where we are now?
Well, I think one of the places I would like to take her is the small cemetery, Mount Zion Cemetery on South Wall Street. I don't know if any of you have been there. And I would show her the 17 graves of black Civil War soldiers who belonged to the colored regiments, all with Dutch names, by the way, just to let her know what an impact her message had to inspire people to do as she did and fight for freedom. As far as modern life, it makes my head spin sometime. I can't imagine what she would think of everybody walking around looking at little things like this. Any other? Yes.
Thank you for that remarkable talk. Fascinating. And I wonder if you know that we have tonight the sculptor of the poor human Sojourner Truth here with us.
Is she? Oh, I didn't see her. Please stand up, Trina. Yes. Very good. Right. Yes, it's been wonderful working with Trina. You know, our committee came to her with some very hardened opinions of how we wanted her to look. And Trina just took all of that and created a sculpture that I think that when you see it in its bronze state, you will just be moved by the look on her face. We all choked up when we saw it. It was such a wonderful, wonderful face. Thank you, Trina. Yes?
How will we be able to know when that's going to be, when that celebration is going to be?
Oh, well, I'm sure it will be covered by our local papers, and I'm just going to twist arms up at WAMC and tell Alan Shartok he's got to get on board with us with this, because this is a really important event. I don't know of another statue of a slave child in this country. And so just from that respect alone, I think it deserves attention. So we'll be putting up a great big sign on 9W and all kinds of things. So.
Maybe you and Trina could arrange to be interviewed.
Oh,
Shortly before
yes.
by Joe Donahue
Yep.
or Alan Sharp.
Right. And also, Reverend Clark is a wonderful singer. She sings the songs from this period so beautifully, and she can almost channel Sojourner as she reads from some of the writings about her. She adds a tremendous amount to any presentation that we do. Yes.
Any other questions?
Oh, Trina, yes.
I wanted to know if she didn't understand this.
Yes, she did. Yeah. I don't think they liked each other very much, He was kind of bombastic, and she was pretty mouthy, and I don't think that they did too. I mean, look how she stood up after he made his statement about blood and brought God into it. But that whole abolitionist community was very tight-knit, and they all shared so many hardships and such a sense of purpose that they were wonderful. And I think not many people know that a large percentage of the abolitionist speakers were in fact black, and because they could actually testify to slavery, to its evil effects on man and family, and so they were a pretty tight-knit group. And Auburn, New York, was one of the headquarters for this area, where they all came up and stayed with some people who later became famous for women's rights as well. Yes?
You said that she was married and had 3 children. What happened to her
4.
husband?
Well, he was quite a bit older than she was, and when it became time for him to be freed, he was certainly over 28, he declined. He just wanted to stay where he was, and there were a lot like that. They were apprehensive about what life held for them after emancipation, and rightly so. Not everybody had Sojourner's grit to face it, and besides, because of immigration coming into this country, bringing other sources of cheap labor, slavery became extremely uneconomical. You had to feed a slave and keep him a whole year just when he worked in the fields during, growing time, whereas with the cheap labor from Europe, you could hire them for the harvest and then send them on their way. You had to feed and clothe their children and so forth. So it really was not economical. And at the same time, when emancipated blacks began to go into the labor market, they changed the rules on them and said, no, we don't want a blacksmith, we want a white one. And so the very things that they had spent their lives learning suddenly were of no value. It was a very hard life, very hard. And one of the reasons that the poorhouse in New Paltz was built was because there were so many old black former slaves with no homes. They were brought to the poorhouse and there put to work growing food and so forth. So, yes.
I think you said she had 4 children.
Yes, 4.
I lost track of one of them.
Well, Peter was the son, okay, and then she had 3 daughters. One daughter married and lived in Schenectady or somewhere, but the other 2 daughters were with her for most of their life. They both married and had large families, but they all lived together in Battle Creek at the end. And Thomas McLeachy, the man I met there, is the 5th great-grandson of her daughter Sophie. I'm going back to Battle Creek next week. In the state of Michigan, on November 26 is Sojourner Truth Day for the whole state every year. Look at that, New York State. Where are you? And they're having a big banquet, and I'm going to be the speaker. So glad I had a chance to practice. And I'm just looking forward to seeing all the people I met there last time, Battle Creek has one of the biggest monuments to the Underground Railroad that I've ever seen in my life. It's about 3 stories tall and has over 40 figures on it, and it is just the most impressive thing. So they take that heritage very seriously. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm an 8th grandnephew of Isaac Van Wagenen.
Oh, wonderful.
And I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the children that email me when they're given an assignment on Sojourner Truth. And I am the family genealogist. I say duh because I think I really
Right.
I've been doing it for 33 years.
Yes.
And they write and they ask for information about how they're related to Sojourner Truth.
Oh.
And I explained to them how Sojourner went to Isaac and Maria.
Yes.
And they kept her and eventually set her free on her own.
Yes, yes.
And they all, well, not all of them, but a great many of them, or their parents, email me back and tell me how their children aced their project on Sojourner Truth.
Wonderful.
Cool.
Yes, yes. Well, maybe you should create a little thing on the web answering all the questions at once that you can just send out. I mean, I believe in that very strongly. Right. Well, it's amazing how many kids today are doing original source material research for their projects. It makes me feel very good that they aren't just looking it up on Google or something, but actually reaching out to people.
I have a section on my webpage, cvanwagenen.com,
Right.
which pertains to Sojourner.
Oh, good, good. Well, aren't you glad your name isn't Dumond or Gedney? Our town historian was Dottie Dumond, but she was a Dumond with a D, and it wasn't quite the same family. But she said she once talked to a group of school children, and they said to her, "Oh, you're related to that man who was so mean to Sojourner Truth." No, she said. Yes?
And one of the quotes that pops up in almost all the stories is, I'm probably not being accurate, but it has to do with I am woman.
Ain't I a woman? Yes, the speech that, yes. Yeah, well, there's some dispute as to whether she actually gave the speech or not, but frankly, I don't care because such a wonderful speech, somebody should have given it, and I'm just as happy to have it accrue to her credit. And certainly the people who do Sojourner Truth reenactings, and there's some wonderful ones around, do include that speech. The only thing I find interesting, and this is true of everyone who wrote about her who had actually met her, is that they found it impossible to reproduce her Dutch accent. And so instead, they give her an accent of Mammy from Gone with the Wind. And she was very indignant about that herself and said, "I never called anyone honey chow." But that's, that's just one of the problems. But that's a wonderful speech. I don't care who gave it. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned Seneca Falls.
Yes.
Do you have any connection to like Elizabeth Kingston?
Yes, because those people were all involved in the abolitionist movement and in the rights for women movement starting in 1848. Well, that's the time period when she was traveling around. And so she was also a great speaker on behalf of rights for women. That's where the Ain't I a Woman speech comes out of. And she was also a great fighter for the rights of released prisoners to have a decent life and their rights while in prison to get humane treatment. She was very aware of all these things. And
When there's the separation between sort of the abolitionists and the suffragettes, for lack of a better word, what side of that does she fall on?
well, I don't know that there was a separation, no. I know that there were some of the women's rights advocates who didn't want to get involved in the abolitionists because it would lead to war. They were also very interested in peace. But I don't think she ever had to come down one way or another. Yeah. Yep. What great questions. Anybody else? Yes.
Are her children named Truth or their last name?
No, they have the names of her daughter's husbands. So whatever they were, because Peter didn't survive. He was missing from one of the whaling voyages, and no one is really sure what happened to him, whether he fell overboard or died of smallpox in a port. But the two daughters had their married names, and those are the names that the children first started with. Yeah. Yes?
Was the courthouse in Newport created for the black population that were imprisoned there?
For the black population, what?
Yeah, the slaves that they put into the courthouse, was it created for them?
Well, that was one of the reasons it was created. There were an awful lot of unemployed people tramping the roads in those days because with the end of slavery, the economy in New Paltz just plummeted. All their free labor was gone mostly, and if you look at the agricultural records from that period of time, their output went way down, and then the Erie Canal did away with a tremendous amount of agricultural. So there were hard times for people, and there were a lot of people wandering the roads, and especially old ones needing help. And so at that time, poor houses were being built all over the state. Yeah.
How did the canal affect?
Because they could bring the wheat from the west, which they could grow great swath. We couldn't begin to grow the kind of wheat they were growing in the west, and that just did away with the wheat growth here. They had to look for other kinds of agriculture. Yep. Okay.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you all so much for coming. Right.
Anne, thank you. Thank you very much. And we are very fortunate to have Anne and all the speakers we have for our subjects for this lecture series. The purpose of this lecture series is to bring back some of the important historical figures from our community. None is probably as well known as Sojourner Truth. Certainly none are known outside of the planet Earth besides Sojourner Truth. But that's what the purpose of this is. The people in our community have affected not only our community, but New York State, the United States, and the world. And Sojourner Truth is a perfect example of that. She's a perfect example that one person can make a difference. Here's somebody who never learned how to read or write, and look at what she did. And we're fortunate to have Anne and all of our speakers who come here. They've dedicated years of their life to these subjects. And we're able to, in an hour, benefit and learn greatly from what they've spent years doing and sifting through documents. And it's wonderful that we're able to do that. And we really ask you to thank the speakers. And if you see them, Anne is a wealth of knowledge, certainly about Sojourner Truth and about many, many things. And I know she's always availed herself to me. Corinne Nyquist is here. She has a web page on the SUNY New Paltz Library about Sojourner Truth. It's wonderful. Trina is here. I will tell you that my day job is Commissioner of Jurors for Ulster County, and I do a little history lesson on the courthouse for the jurors every time they come in. Trina was there one day, and she was very quick to correct me on a couple misconceptions that I had about Sojourner Truth. So I appreciate that. So these people really have dedicated a lot so that we are able to benefit from them tonight. And please, if you get a chance, thank them. I also want to take the opportunity just to thank a few other people. The Senate House, we are in the Senate House Museum tonight. The Senate House stays open for us to have this. In fact, now they're closed for the winter. And they've opened up specifically tonight, and every night we have this. Bless you. So we have Tom and Jacob are here tonight. They set everything up, and they do all this. Everyone involved in this lecture series donates their time and effort. So we want to thank them. Everybody, the members of the Kingston's Buried Treasure are listed here. I won't go through them, but everybody dedicates their time and their effort to do this. We all love history, and we're glad to do it, and we're glad that all of you come tonight. We have Bob Rizzo in the back. He's the one, if you've been coming here, he tapes these. He worked for NBC for many, many years, so we're fortunate to have him. He's a true professional. And he also puts these on Esopus Community TV, Channel 23. So this will be running for the next week, starting Sunday at 11 a.m. and 8 p.m. if you want to watch it. If you want a copy of the DVD, you can touch base with Bob. We have Joe Tantillo puts together the PowerPoint presentation. He also puts together the flyers that I left out. And again, every presentation we do a new flyer. It has a little bit about the person, the subject, and it also has the next 2 subjects in the series. If you come on up and put your name and email address, I'll be happy to email them to you as soon as they come out. They usually come out the week after we finish the prior presentation. I also want to thank, there are a number of people who publicize this event for us. And many of you are here because of that. And it's important, they're also doing this because they want to help out the community, and they are historically minded as well. Ulster County Tourism gets the word out, Kingston Happenings, Channel 23, the Esopus community TV station does with Bob, Jillian Fisher does, and Hugh Reynolds from the Kingston Times, who's here every presentation. He meets with the speakers, he writes stories on it. We really need to thank these people. I know Hugh he's a community-minded reporter, but he also is a lover of history, and this is what we're trying to do. There are many, many people in our community that we've completely forgotten about, and they've made unbelievable contributions, and that's what we're trying to do here. So, most importantly, we want to thank you for all coming here. If you could keep coming, we'll keep going. There are an endless supply of people here in Ulster County and Kingston in particular that have affected, as I said, our nation and certainly our state. The next 2 presentations we have is December 14th is Thomas Cornell, the Vanderbilt of the Roundout. Thomas Cornell is a person that most people have not heard of, which boggles my mind. He was somebody beginning in the early 1800s and until his death in 1890, he controlled every industry in Roundout. And Roundout was an incredibly busy place. He controlled the steamships. He controlled the towing. He controlled the railroads. He owned one of the Kingston hotels. He controlled bluestone. He controlled cement. He was an unbelievable person. And we're fortunate to have Stuart Murray presenting that next month, again, December 14th. And he is, I believe, the author of the only book on Thomas Cornell. So we hope you can join us then. January 18th, it's always going to be a Friday. We try to do this every 3rd Friday of the month, starting at 5:30 right here. This month and next month, due to the holidays, they've changed to the 2nd Friday. But the subject on January 18th is Colonel George Chandler, who is the founder and first superintendent of the New York State Police. He is a Kingston resident. He is also the namesake of Colonel Chandler Drive, which I believe is the shortest interstate in the United States. He is also the individual who chose the purple or lavender color for the New York State Troopers. There's 2 stories of how that color came to be. I will let Major Robin Benziger from the New York State Police, who will be the presenter for that, come and tell you. But again, we thank you, and if you have any questions, please let us know. As a side note to Ann's presentation for a couple of people, Abraham Brune Hasbrook, there were 2 Abraham Hasbrooks as well at the same time. They were, I believe, cousins as well. Abraham Brune Hasbrook was known as A. Brune Hasbrook, thus a Brune Street. He subsequently went out to St. Remy, where he built a house. It's still standing. It's privately owned, and he is the founder of St. Remy. One of the other... Yep. Yep. And I would highly recommend, if you're interested in local history, there is a book by Ed Ford, who is right here. It's called Streetwise, Street, W-H-Y-S. And it is a story on how each street in Kingston got its name. And they're all named after figures. Many D&H Canal directors, many of the important people who've been in Kingston. They're short little stories about each street, and they're unbelievably interesting. It is probably the best primer on local history. I highly recommend you get it. You could probably talk to Ed, and I'm sure he can tell you how to get it, but I know you can buy it at some of the local bookstores. Another of the attorneys who worked on Sojourner Truth's case was a man named Charles Ruggles, and he went on to become a judge in the New York State Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in New York. His portrait is actually, if you're ever up there, it's a beautiful place. They have portraits of every Justice, who's been up there. His portrait is up there, and he contributed as well to Sojourner Truth's case. So again, we thank you very much. We hope we see you in December and January and thereafter. Please leave your email here. We'll be happy to send you the flyers as they come out, and we hope to see you then. Please, anything you need about Sojourner Truth, come see Ann.